In September of 1658, Oliver Cromwell dies. There is a period of time in which the Puritan, Congregationalist, Presbyterian wings of the Commonwealth try to find a new leader for this Commonwealth of England. But in 1660, some leaders of the English army installed Charles II, the son of Charles I, as monarch. This is met with widespread support, and the power that the Presbyterian wing has over the English Commonwealth erodes, and there is the reestablishment of the monarchy, and there is widespread support for the return of the establishment of the Church of England as this episcopal polity based in the worship of the Book of Common Prayer. And so now we have moved into the period of the restoration of the Church of England and really the beginning of Anglicanism. So we're going to follow that through the rest of this video. Charles II, as he consolidates his authority, passes through Parliament in 1662 a new Act of Uniformity that is meant to reestablish the Church of England and to ensure that all ministers conform to it. There is a requirement of assenting to this Act of Uniformity by all duly recognized clergy of the Church of England. 20% refused to do so. These are mostly Puritan dissenters. They depart the Church of England. This is known by historians as the Great Ejection. And these dissenters form so-called free churches, mostly independent or congregationalist in nature. On August 24th, 1662, every minister is required to lead a public act of worship and then, before the congregation, sign a document consenting to the use of the Book of Common Prayer and uphold the authority of the 39 Articles. And all who refuse to do so would be deprived of their position. So what we have is the vast majority choosing to conform, 80% of the clergy, and 20% refusing to do so. This is another significant factor in the development of English denominationalism and the influence that is going to have on the United States religious landscape as well. As well, in 1662, through Act of Parliament, a revised Book of Common Prayer is approved. This is basically the 1559 Book of Common Prayer under Queen Elizabeth with some minor changes. There's now a liturgy for worship at sea as the kind of empire of Britain expands. There's a literature for the baptism of adults, as some had been born in this period when infant baptism wasn't being practiced. It also recognizes the reality that there are going to be slaves and indigenous people being baptized in some parts of this new British Empire. The preface to the 1662 Book of Common Prayer contains this statement attributed to Charles. It hath been the wisdom of the Church of England ever since the first compiling of her public liturgy to keep the means between the two extremes of too much stiffness in refusing and of too much easiness in admitting any variation from it. This really captures what is an emerging Anglican ethos of both trying to preserve tradition and allow for the possibility, of tradition to develop, for the public worship to change and alter. There is thus this introduction of this dynamic between context and tradition that will be important in Anglican life and thoughts. So the Book of Common Prayer is revised in order to help preserve unity but also a desire to encourage reverence or respect for the Book of Common Prayer in order to eliminate ongoing infighting over it and the nature of the liturgy, which is this infighting between Puritans and conformists. Charles is really hoping to finally put a stop to this, which he really has in some ways because of this requirement of the Act of Uniformity, which leads to the departure from the Church of England of many of these Puritan sympathizers. And so then we have what we would describe as a restoration of conformist Anglicanism. That is that the teaching of the Church of England, its doctrine, and its leadership is even more deeply attached to episcopal polity and to the prayer book. And many clergy now, in this post-Civil War context, very consciously reject Reformed and Calvinist doctrine because of the way it was associated with revolution, with the execution of the monarch, and with the suppression of the established church. So whereas before the English Civil War, there was a Reformed consensus within the Church of England, the Church of England, as is reestablished and restored, begins to consciously distance itself from that Reformed heritage. The Church of England emphasizes the divine nature and origin of both monarchical government and episcopal forms of government. And so these kind of democratizing impulses that were on display in the acts of the Long Parliament and the English Commonwealth are really seen as antithetical to this new reality of restoration. Charles II himself is a very reluctant supporter of the Church of England. It had long been rumored that he had Roman Catholic allegiances, and indeed on his deathbed formally converts to Roman Catholicism. This causes a real scandal and real anxiety. His brother, James II, takes the English throne in 1685. He is openly Roman Catholic. And now there's a real question. How can a Roman Catholic be the supreme head of the Protestant Church of England? So there's widespread opposition to his rule. He is forced to resign the throne because he is very prominently aiding English Roman Catholics. This leads in 1688 to his son-in-law, Willem of Orange, who is Dutch Reformed, being made king as William III, and he rules with his Stuart Anglican wife, Mary. So Mary is the sister of James II, or I'm sorry, the daughter of James II. And so she takes over from her father, and along with Willem of Orange. This is known as the Glorious Revolution, because most of the English political establishment goes along with it. So there's a change in the monarchy without anyone being executed, which is quite a good thing for everyone involved. James II, though, enters into rebellion against Willem and Mary, and he is defeated in Ireland, leading a Catholic force against this English Anglican Protestant force in the battles of Boyne and Arran in 1690 and 1691. This then hardens the Protestant Catholic divide in parts of Ireland and Scotland. What happens after that is an act of toleration is passed as a means of trying to further keep the peace between Anglicans and dissenters. The Toleration Act of 1689 allows for the presence of some dissenting churches that are more reformed and congregationalist in their polity. So what this really does is it begins to provide civil rights for non-Anglicans. And we also have in the mix here Baptists and Quakers as well. So Roman Catholics aren't tolerated. You can't legally have a Roman Catholic church yet in England. But all these other forms of non-Anglican Protestants are allowed to worship and exist in England. So what we now have is England as a Protestant state with an established Church of England that tolerates other dissenting Protestants. And so now this whole question of loyalty to the state and fidelity to one's religious conscience gets resolved, where now one could be loyal to the state without being loyal to the established Church of England. And I argue here that this is really the moment where Anglicanism comes into existence, with the Toleration Act of 1689. You have Anglicanism that has really moved in significant ways out of its Reformed heritage. The Puritan wing has ceased to exist. And you really only have Anglicanism when you have other forms of Protestant internal to England to define it against. It doesn't make sense to use the label Anglican when the only option was one church, the Church of England. But Anglicanism as a category begins to make sense when it is consciously self-defined against being a Presbyterian or a Congregationalist or a Baptist or a Quaker. So this is a significant moment in the development of Protestantism, and clearly a watershed for an Anglican and Episcopal identity. As we move on next, we're going to be looking at religion in the English American colonies. That is a parallel process with what we've been describing unfolding in England.